In the heart of the English countryside, where ancient oaks whispered secrets and morning mist clung to forgotten paths, Juliet Ashford made a choice that would scandalize every drawing room in London. Rather than surrender to a fate dictated by her family's debts and society's demands, she vanished into the wilderness, seeking shelter in a crumbling gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of an abandoned estate. For 3 weeks, she lived in shadows and silence, believing herself safe from the world that sought to claim her. But on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn, when thunder rolled across the moors and her meagre fire struggled against the cold, the heavy oak door burst open. There, silhouetted against the storm, stood the Duke of Thornbury himself, the very man she'd been running from. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The Ashford residence on Grosvenor Square had always been a place of elegant deception. Behind its pristine white columns and polished brass fixtures, behind the silk wallpaper imported from Paris and the crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light in 1,000 brilliant fragments, lay a truth that Juliet Ashford had only recently discovered. Her family was drowning in debt. At 22, Juliet possessed the kind of beauty that poets attempted to capture in verse, but inevitably failed. Honey-colored hair that caught the light like spun gold, eyes the color of morning sky over the Thames, and a delicate grace that made her the subject of countless whispered conversations at balls and soirees. But it was her mind, sharp and curious, that truly set her apart, though she'd learned early to disguise her intelligence beneath practiced smiles and demure glances. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, had been a gambler, not the romantic kind from Gothic novels, but the desperate, destructive sort who wagered away estates, heirlooms, and finally, his daughter's future. When he died 6 months ago, thrown from his horse while riding home drunk from his club, he left behind nothing but creditors and a widow too fragile to face the wreckage. Juliet's mother, Lady Catherine, had wept delicately into embroidered handkerchiefs while explaining the solution that had been arranged. "Lord Blackwood has agreed to forgive the debts," she'd said, her voice trembling with what Juliet had initially mistaken for relief. "All of them, in exchange for your hand in marriage, Vincent Blackwood, Earl of Ravenscross. 43 years old, twice widowed under circumstances that polite society chose not to examine too closely, and possessed of a fortune built on textile mills where children worked 16-hour days in conditions that made Juliet's stomach turn. She'd met him twice, once at a dinner party where his eyes had lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl, and once at the opera, where his hand on her elbow had felt like a shackle. "He's quite distinguished," her mother had insisted, arranging the morning room's flowers with trembling hands. "And generous. Think of what this means for your sisters, Juliet. Emily and Charlotte are still so young. Without this marriage, we'll lose everything. The house, the servants, your sisters' prospects." The emotional blackmail was as elegant as their surroundings, and just as carefully constructed. Juliet had 3 younger sisters, Emily, 17 and gentle as a dove, Charlotte, 15 and full of fire, and little Beatrice, barely 12. Without Juliet's sacrifice, they would be ruined. Marriageable daughters of an impoverished family carried no value in the marriage market. They would fade into genteel poverty, becoming governesses or companions if they were lucky. So Juliet had agreed. What choice did she have? She loved her sisters fiercely, protectively, with a devotion that overrode her own desires. She would marry Lord Blackwood, endure whatever came after, and ensure her family's survival. The engagement had been announced in the Times. Wedding preparations began immediately. Blackwood wanted to marry quickly, before the end of the season. Juliet's days became a blur of fittings and arrangements, of selecting china patterns and approving guest lists, all while maintaining the appearance of a joyful bride-to-be. But at night, alone in her chamber, Juliet allowed herself to dream of a different life. She imagined a marriage based on mutual respect, perhaps even affection, a partner who valued her thoughts as much as her appearance, who might discuss books and politics rather than simply expecting ornamental silence. She pictured a home filled with warmth rather than cold duty, children raised with love rather than aristocratic distance. These were foolish dreams, she knew. Marriage in their world was a transaction, not a romance. Still, the human heart persists in hoping, even when logic counsels despair. It was during one of these sleepless nights, 3 weeks before the wedding, that Juliet overheard the conversation that changed everything. Unable to sleep, she'd ventured downstairs for a book from her father's library. As she approached, she heard voices, her mother and Lord Blackwood, speaking in tones they believed private. "The girl is adequately docile," Blackwood's voice rumbled through the door. "Young enough to be properly trained. My previous wives had too much spirit, too many opinions. This one will suit my needs perfectly." "She's intelligent," Lady Catherine said, a warning note in her voice. "Intelligence in a woman is like a knife," Blackwood replied. "Dangerous if not properly controlled. But I have methods. My late wife learned quickly enough that defiance carried consequences. The girl's youth and desire to please will make her even more malleable." Juliet's blood had turned to ice. Malleable, trained, consequences. These were words used for breaking horses, not cherishing wives. "And the sisters?" her mother asked, her voice smaller now. "Will be no concern of mine once the marriage is complete. The debt will be forgiven. The house will be yours for your lifetime. After that," he'd shrugged, the gesture audible in his tone, "they can find their own way. I've paid handsomely for one Ashford daughter. I don't intend to support the entire family indefinitely." Juliet had fled back to her room, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. She'd paced until dawn, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. By the time morning light crept through her curtains, she'd made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She would not marry Vincent Blackwood. She would not be trained, broken, or controlled, and if her refusal meant scandal and ruin, so be it. Better honest poverty than a lifetime of genteel imprisonment. The problem, of course, was that her refusal alone would accomplish nothing. Blackwood held the power. He could call in the debts immediately, have them thrown into debtor's prison if he chose. Her mother would never support her rebellion, and where could an unmarried woman of gentle birth go? She had no money of her own, no skills deemed suitable for employment, no relatives willing to harbour a runaway bride and risk Blackwood's considerable wrath. For 2 weeks, Juliet maintained her facade while desperately searching for a solution. She sold what few pieces of jewellery she possessed, gathering a pitiful sum that might sustain her for a month if she were careful. She studied maps of the countryside in her father's library, looking for forgotten places where a woman might hide. And then she remembered Thornbury Manor. The estate bordered their own country property, though the Ashfords hadn't visited their Suffolk holdings in years. Thornbury had been abandoned for nearly a decade, ever since the old Duke died and his heir, a younger son unexpectedly elevated to the title, disappeared to his diplomatic post in Vienna. The main house would be locked and watched, but Juliet remembered a gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of the property, tucked into the woods near the stream. As children, she and her sisters had played there during summer visits. It had been empty even then, gradually returning to nature. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it might buy her time to think, to plan, to find a way forward that didn't end with her spirit broken in Blackwood's cold mansion. 3 days before the wedding, Juliet executed her escape. She left at dawn, telling the servants she was taking an early morning ride, as she often did. Instead of heading to the park, she rode north, pushing her mare hard towards Suffolk. She carried only what she could fit in her saddlebags, a change of clothes, her small hoard of coins, a knife from the kitchen, matches, and a few books. Everything else, her beautiful gowns, her comfortable life, her very identity as Miss Juliet Ashford of Grosvenor Square, she left behind. The ride took 2 days. She slept in a haystack the first night, paying a suspicious farmer's wife for bread and cheese. By the time she reached Thornbury Manor's grounds, she was exhausted, filthy, and more frightened than she'd ever been in her life. The gamekeeper's cottage was still there, exactly as she remembered. A small stone structure with a sagging roof and broken windows, nearly invisible beneath a tangle of ivy and encroaching forest. It was perfect, isolated, forgotten, and just barely habitable. Juliet had been hiding there for 3 weeks now, living like a ghost in the woods. She survived on what she could forage and purchase from a village several miles away, always wearing a cloak and keeping her face hidden. The cottage was cold, damp, and thoroughly miserable, but it was hers. She answered to no one, obeyed no one, and each morning she woke to the profound relief of having escaped her fate. She knew it couldn't last. The scandal would be immense, a bride vanishing days before her wedding. Blackwood would be furious, her family devastated. They would search for her, of course, but she'd been careful, leaving no trail, and Thornbury Manor was the last place anyone would think to look, abandoned as it was, or so she believed. Until the evening the Duke came home. The storm arrived without warning, as autumn tempests often do in Suffolk. One moment the sky was merely grey and brooding. The next, rain lashed the forest with vindictive force, and wind howled through the trees like a living thing seeking entry. Juliet had been gathering kindling before the weather turned, and she'd barely made it back to the cottage before the deluge began. Her fire struggled bravely against the damp, producing more smoke than warmth. She huddled close to it, wrapped in every piece of clothing she possessed, trying to read by its feeble light. But concentration proved impossible. The storm's fury rattled the cottage's bones, and rain found its way through gaps in the roof, creating a symphony of drips into strategically placed buckets. She was just considering retreating to the bedroom, where the ceiling leaked less profusely, when she heard it, the sound of a horse approaching through the storm. Then voices, muffled by wind and rain but unmistakably human. Male voices, speaking with the cultured accents of gentlemen. Terror seized her. They'd found her. Somehow, impossibly, they'd tracked her to this forgotten corner of the world. Blackwood had come to drag her back to London, to force her into the marriage she'd risked everything to escape. Juliet scrambled to her feet, looking wildly around the cottage for a place to hide. But before she could move, the door exploded inward with a crash that made her cry out in shock. A man stood in the doorway, soaked to the skin, dark hair plastered to his head, eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't immediately identify. He was tall, powerfully built, younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, and possessed of a face that would have been handsome if not twisted with fury. "What?" he said, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "Is the meaning of this?" Behind him a second man appeared, older, greying at the temples, carrying the bearing of a military officer. He placed a restraining hand on the first man's shoulder. "Your Grace, perhaps—" "Don't!" The first man shook him off, taking a step into the cottage. Water puddled beneath his boots. His eyes never left Juliet's face. "I have spent the last 3 weeks travelling from Vienna, rushing home because I received word that my property has been invaded by squatters. I've ridden through this godforsaken storm for hours, and I find a woman, alone, apparently living in my gamekeeper's cottage as though she has every right to it. So I ask again, what is the meaning of this?" Juliet's mind raced. "Your Grace." She'd heard the older man's address, but it made no sense. The Duke of Thornbury was abroad. Everyone knew that. The estate had been abandoned for years. "Frederick Thornbury, Duke of Thornbury, at your service." His tone made a mockery of the courtesy. "Though I suspect you knew that already, given that you've chosen to make yourself at home on my property. What I don't know is your name, or what possible excuse you could offer for this intrusion." Frederick Thornbury. Juliet's stomach dropped. She knew the name, though she'd never met the man. He'd inherited the dukedom unexpectedly when his older brother died without issue, but he'd been in diplomatic service on the continent and had rarely returned to England. No one had expected him to come back now, and certainly not without warning. She struggled to find words, her careful plans crumbling around her. I didn't know. No one said you'd returned. That's because I didn't announce my return. He moved further into the cottage, his presence seeming to fill the small space. I prefer to inspect my properties without the fanfare of an official homecoming. Quite fortunate, as it turns out, since it's allowed me to discover a trespasser. The word stung. She wasn't a common trespasser. She was, what, a fugitive from her own life? A gentlewoman reduced to squatting in abandoned buildings? The truth was hardly more dignified than his accusation. "Your Grace," the older man interjected, stepping inside and closing the door against the storm. "Perhaps we might approach this with less hostility. The young lady is clearly alone and trespassing, Major Harrison." Frederick's eyes remained fixed on Juliet. "Though I admit to curiosity about how a woman of obvious quality, your clothing, however worn, speaks of means, comes to be living in squalor in an abandoned cottage. Are you running from something, madam? Or someone?" His perception was uncomfortably sharp. Juliet lifted her chin, trying to summon some dignity despite her disheveled state. "That is my own affair, Your Grace. Not when it occurs on my property, it isn't." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of rain and horse and something else. Sandalwood, perhaps, or cedar. "I should have you arrested, at the very least removed immediately." Fear spiked through her. "Please," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. "I've done no damage. I've been careful, quiet. I only needed a place to hide." His voice softened fractionally. "Yes, I gathered that much. The question is why? What drives a lady of breeding, and don't bother denying it, your accent alone gives you away, to such desperate measures?" Juliet bit her lip, weighing her options. She could refuse to answer, but he had every right to throw her out into the storm. She could lie, but something in his steady gaze suggested he would see through any fabrication. Or she could tell the truth, or at least part of it, and hope for mercy. "I was running from a marriage," she said finally. "One I could not bear to enter." Frederick's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features. "You're a runaway bride?" "I suppose that's what they're calling me in London." She tried to smile, but it felt broken on her lips. "Though I prefer to think of myself as a woman exercising her right to choose her own fate." "3 weeks ago?" Major Harrison spoke suddenly. "Young lady, are you by any chance Miss Juliet Ashford?" The blood drained from her face. "How did you—" "It was the scandal of the season," Harrison explained, his tone gentler than Frederick's. "A bride disappearing days before her wedding to the Earl of Ravencross. The family claimed you'd suffered a nervous collapse and retired to the country for your health. But the rumors, well, everyone knew you'd run. Ravencross." Frederick's voice had gone hard again. "Vincent Blackwood." "You know him?" Juliet asked, surprised. "I know his reputation." Something dark moved behind Frederick's eyes. "I know what happened to his previous wives. And I know that any woman desperate enough to flee into hiding rather than marry him showed more wisdom than cowardice." His words, so unexpected and so completely aligned with her own feelings, nearly undid her. Tears pricked her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. She'd survived 3 weeks alone. She would not break now simply because someone had shown her unexpected understanding. "Nevertheless," Frederick continued, though his tone had lost some of its edge, "you cannot remain here. The cottage is barely habitable. You're clearly not equipped for this kind of existence, and—" "I'll manage," Juliet interrupted. "I've been managing. For 3 weeks. What happens when winter comes? This place will be uninhabitable. You'll freeze. Then I'll find somewhere else. With what resources?" He gestured around the cottage. "You have nothing, no money, judging by the state of things, no proper supplies. You're running on borrowed time and stubbornness. Better that than the alternative." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with all the fear and desperation she'd been holding at bay. Frederick stepped back slightly, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your Grace," Harrison said carefully, "perhaps we might discuss this after we've had time to rest and dry off. The storm isn't abating, and we've been riding for hours. Whatever decision needs to be made about Miss Ashford's situation, surely it can wait until morning." Frederick looked as though he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "Fine. Miss Ashford, you may remain here tonight. Tomorrow, we will discuss a more permanent solution to your situation. And before you protest," he held up a hand as she opened her mouth, "that is not a negotiation. You are on my property, and you will abide by my decisions regarding its use. Is that understood?" Juliet wanted to argue, to assert her independence, to tell this arrogant duke that she needed no one's permission or help. But practicality warred with pride, and for once, practicality won. She had nowhere else to go, no resources left, and winter was indeed coming. She'd been trying not to think about it, but Frederick was right. She couldn't survive here indefinitely. "Understood," she said quietly. "Good." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Ashford, I don't blame you for running. Blackwood is a villain in gentleman's clothing, but running accomplishes nothing if you have nowhere to run to. Tomorrow we'll find you a proper solution." He left then, Harrison following after one last sympathetic glance at Juliet. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched them ride toward the main house, which apparently wasn't as abandoned as she'd believed. Juliet sank onto her makeshift bed, her mind whirling. She'd been discovered. Her hiding place was compromised, and tomorrow the Duke of Thornbury, a man she'd known for all of 10 minutes, intended to decide her fate. She should be terrified. She should be planning her next escape. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Frederick's expression had shifted when he'd heard Blackwood's name, the dark understanding in his eyes. He knew. Somehow, he understood why she'd run. It shouldn't matter. She couldn't trust anyone, least of all a duke with the power to hand her back to Blackwood if he chose. But as the storm raged outside and her fire slowly died, Juliet couldn't shake the memory of Frederick's final words. "Tomorrow, we'll find you a proper solution. We, not I," as though her problem had somehow become shared. Juliet pulled her thin blanket tighter and tried not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. But still, treacherously, it flickered in her chest like the embers of her failing fire. Tomorrow would tell whether that hope was justified or foolish. Morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that often follows storms. Sunlight streamed through the cottage's broken windows, illuminating dust motes and the full extent of the squalor Juliet had been living in. By daylight, her refuge looked even more pathetic than it had felt. Water stains on the walls, gaps in the roof, her few possessions scattered like the remnants of a shipwreck. She was attempting to make herself presentable, braiding her unwashed hair with fingers stiff from cold, when a knock sounded at the door. Not the angry pounding of last night, but a proper, courteous knock. Still, her heart raced as she called, "Enter!" Frederick Thornbury stepped inside, looking completely transformed from the soaked, furious figure of the previous evening. In daylight and dry clothing, he was undeniably handsome. Dark hair neatly arranged, strong jaw freshly shaved, grey eyes keen and intelligent. He wore country clothes, well-tailored but practical, and carried himself with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to command. "Miss Ashford." He inclined his head politely, as though they were meeting in a drawing room rather than a dilapidated cottage. "I hope you slept well." It was absurd enough to make her laugh. "As well as one can on a straw mattress in a building that leaks like a sieve, Your Grace." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Quite. Which brings me to the purpose of my visit. I have a proposition for you." Juliet tensed. "I will not return to London. I will not marry Lord Blackwood. If those are your terms, they are not." He held up a hand. "Please, let me explain before you assume the worst. I spent considerable time last night thinking about your situation. You cannot remain here, that much is evident. But neither can you return to London without facing immediate pressure to fulfill your engagement to Blackwood. Your family's debts remain, and he still holds that leverage over them." Each word was a knife twist of truth. Juliet's chest tightened. "I'm aware. However," Frederick continued, There may be an alternative. I need a hostess. He blinked. I beg your pardon? Thornbury Manor has been closed for nearly a decade. I intend to restore it, to re-establish my presence in local society. That requires a woman's touch, someone to manage the household, oversee renovations, serve as hostess for dinner parties and social events. He paused. I'm offering you that position. Juliet stared at him. You want me to work for you? In a manner of speaking, the position would be unique. You would live at the manor, have your own quarters, a generous allowance for clothing and personal expenses. In exchange, you would help me return Thornbury to its former glory. It would give you respectable employment, a place to live, and protection from Blackwood's reach. It was so unexpected that Juliet struggled to form words. Your Grace, a woman in my position cannot simply become your employee. The scandal will be mitigated by the presence of my great-aunt. Frederick's expression remained serious. Lady Thornbury lives in the Dower House. She's 83, sharp as a tack, and thoroughly respectable. She will serve as your chaperone and lend credibility to the arrangement. Officially, you will be her companion and my hostess. Unofficially, you will have safety and independence. Why? The question burst from her. Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you but a trespasser you found in your cottage. Frederick was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected weight. Because 5 years ago, I watched my sister enter a marriage to escape our father's debts. Her husband was wealthy, titled, and utterly ruthless. She wrote to me every week for the first year, each letter more desperate than the last, begging me to help her leave. I was in St. Petersburg, embroiled in negotiations that I told myself were too important to abandon. By the time I returned to England, it was too late. She died from a fall down the stairs that no one quite believed was an accident. Juliet's breath caught. Your Grace, I'm so sorry. So am I. His jaw tightened. I failed Rosalind. I prioritized duty over family, and she paid the price. When I found you here last night fleeing a marriage to a man like Blackwood, I saw a chance to do what I didn't do for my sister. I saw a chance to choose differently. The honesty in his voice made Juliet's throat tight. This proud duke was offering her not just help, but understanding born from his own painful regret. It made him suddenly, startlingly human. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say you'll consider it. Come to the manor, meet Lady Thornbury, see what I'm proposing before you decide. If it doesn't suit you, I'll help you find another solution. I have connections, resources. There must be something better than hiding in abandoned cottages. Juliet looked around the cottage, at her pathetic attempts at housekeeping, at the evidence of 3 weeks spent merely surviving rather than living. Then she looked back at Frederick, at the sincerity in his grey eyes. All right, she said quietly. I'll come and see. The walk to Thornbury Manor took 15 minutes through ancient woods, just beginning to show autumn's colours. The main house emerged from the trees like something from a dream, a massive Jacobean structure of warm, honey-coloured stone, with mullioned windows and elaborate chimneys reaching toward the sky. It had the slightly worn appearance of a grand estate long without a master, but even in its semi-neglect, its beauty was undeniable. Inside, the house smelled of dust and disuse, but the bones were magnificent. Soaring ceilings, intricate plasterwork, oak panelling dark with age. Furniture stood shrouded in Holland covers like ghosts awaiting resurrection. It needs work, Frederick admitted, leading her through room after room. Extensive work. But it was my brother's pride, and I find I want to honor his memory by restoring what he loved. That's where you would come in, choosing fabrics and furnishings, hiring staff, making it a home again rather than just a house. Juliet touched a dust-covered table, imagining the work involved. It was overwhelming, but also exciting. She'd been trained her entire life to manage a great household, skills she'd thought would go to waste in Blackwood's cold mansion. Here, they might actually matter. And Lady Thornbury, she asked, lives in the Dower House at the edge of the park. Come, I'll introduce you. Lady Thornbury proved to be a tiny woman with white hair, bright blue eyes, and a personality that filled any room she occupied. She received them in a drawing room cluttered with books, needlework, and what appeared to be a collection of exotic plants. "So this is the runaway bride," she said without preamble, studying Juliet with unnerving intensity. "Good for you, girl. Vincent Blackwood is a monster. I told your mother as much when the engagement was announced, but she wouldn't listen." Juliet gaped. "You know my mother?" "Known Catherine since she was in leading strings. Weak-willed woman always was. Married your father for his looks and lived to regret it. But you," she pointed a gnarled finger at Juliet, "you have steel. Takes courage to run. Foolish, perhaps, but courageous." "Aunt Agatha," Frederick interjected with a mixture of exasperation and affection. "I've explained the situation. Will you support this arrangement?" "Support it? I insist upon it." Lady Thornbury rose from her chair with surprising agility. "The girl needs sanctuary, and you need a hostess. But more than that," she fixed Frederick with a stern look, "you need to learn that duty sometimes means choosing human decency over diplomatic protocol. You're not in Vienna anymore, Frederick. You're home. It's time you remembered what that means." The rebuke was sharp, and Juliet saw Frederick flinch slightly, but he nodded. "You're right, as you usually are." "Of course I am. Now, Miss Ashford, let me show you the rooms Frederick proposes for your use. If they're inadequate, we'll make him do better." The quarters were in the East Wing, a bedroom, sitting room, and private study, all with views over the estate's parkland. They were dusty and draped, but spacious and elegant, with beautiful proportions and delicate plasterwork. "These were Rosalind's rooms," Lady Thornbury said softly. "Frederick's sister. She loved them. I think she'd be glad to know they're being used again, and by someone who needs them." Juliet felt the weight of that trust. "I'll honor her memory," she promised. Over the next days, Juliet settled into Thornbury with a strange mix of trepidation and relief. She worked alongside Frederick and Major Harrison, who turned out to be Frederick's former military companion and current estate steward, assessing what needed to be done. The list was daunting. Repairs to the roof, updated plumbing, new furnishings, hiring of staff. But Frederick threw himself into the work with an intensity that suggested he needed this project as much as she needed the refuge it provided. They fell into a routine. Mornings were spent reviewing accounts and plans with Harrison. Afternoons, Juliet and Frederick would walk the estate, discussing improvements. Evenings they dined with Lady Thornbury, who regaled them with scandalous stories from decades past and asked Juliet pointed questions about her interests and opinions. "You've read Mary Wollstonecraft?" Lady Thornbury asked one evening when Juliet mentioned the philosopher's work. "Yes, my lady. Her arguments for women's education resonated deeply with me." "Resonated enough to make you flee an arranged marriage?" Juliet smiled wryly. "Among other reasons. But yes, her writings helped me understand that I had the right to choose my own path, even if society disagreed." "Good girl." Lady Thornbury glanced at Frederick. "You see, nephew? Intelligence and beauty in one package. Don't let this one slip away." Frederick nearly choked on his wine, and Juliet felt heat flood her cheeks. But there was no real discomfort in it, only a warm embarrassment tinged with something she didn't want to examine too closely, because the truth was she was beginning to enjoy Frederick's company far more than was wise. He was intelligent, well-read, and genuinely interested in her opinions. Their discussions ranged from architecture to politics to literature, and he never once dismissed her thoughts as unsuitable for a woman. He listened, debated, and sometimes changed his mind when she made a compelling argument. More than that, he was kind. Not the performative kindness of men seeking to impress, but the genuine consideration of someone who saw others as fully human. He remembered that she preferred tea to coffee, that drafts made her uncomfortable, that she loved roses. Small things, but they added up to a portrait of a man who paid attention, who cared. It was dangerous, Juliet knew. She'd fled one entanglement only to find herself drawn into the orbit of a different man entirely. But where Blackwood had made her skin crawl, Frederick made her feel safe, seen, valued. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into her stay at Thornbury, they were walking through the estate's overgrown gardens when Frederick suddenly asked, "Are you happy here, Juliet?" He'd started using her given name, and she'd given him leave to do so. It felt natural, less formal than their situation probably warranted. "I am," she said honestly, "happier than I've been in months, perhaps years." "Good." He paused by an ancient fountain, its basin filled with fallen leaves. "Because I've been thinking, the renovations will take months, possibly a year, but after that, what then? Do you see yourself staying at Thornbury indefinitely, or would you want something else?" Juliet considered the question carefully. "I don't know. I haven't let myself think that far ahead. For now, I'm simply grateful to have a place where I'm safe and useful." "You're more than useful, Juliet. You've breathed life back into this place, and into me, if I'm being honest." He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I came back to England because duty demanded it. I intended to restore the estate, fulfill my obligations, and return to Vienna as quickly as possible. But now, I find I don't want to leave." "Frederick," she began, but he shook his head. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that your presence here has mattered. To the house, yes, but also to me personally. I was half alive before, going through motions. Now I feel like I'm actually living again." Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. She should step back, should maintain proper distance. But instead, she found herself saying, "I feel the same way." For a long moment, they simply stood there, autumn leaves drifting around them, the air charged with possibility. Then Frederick smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, and offered her his arm. "Come. Aunt Agatha will have our heads if we're late for tea." As they walked back to the house, Juliet felt something shift inside her. Hope, yes, but more than that. The beginning of something she hadn't dared to imagine just weeks ago. Not just safety, but the possibility of genuine happiness. It wouldn't be easy. Her family still faced ruin, Blackwood still held his power, and society would judge her harshly for her choices. But here, in this moment, with Frederick's steady presence beside her and Thornbury's walls offering sanctuary, Juliet allowed herself to believe that perhaps her story didn't have to end in tragedy after all. Perhaps, against all odds, she might actually get to choose her own ending. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by a courier from London who refused to leave until he'd placed it directly in Juliet's hands. The moment she saw the Ashford family seal, her stomach dropped. She opened it in the privacy of her sitting room, hands trembling slightly. Her mother's familiar handwriting swam before her eyes. "Dearest Juliet, your continued absence has placed us in an impossible position. Lord Blackwood grows increasingly impatient. He has given us until November 1st to produce you for the wedding, or he will call in all debts immediately. Your sisters will be ruined. Emily has already lost her engagement to Mr. Pearson. His family deemed the scandal too great. I understand you were frightened, darling, but surely you see now that there is no alternative. Lord Blackwood has assured me he will be patient and understanding once you are wed. Please come home. Please don't destroy your sisters' lives for the sake of your own fears. Your loving mother, Juliet." Let the letter fall to her lap, feeling sick. November 1st was less than a week away, and Emily, sweet, gentle Emily, who'd been so excited about her engagement to Richard Pearson, had lost her chance at happiness because of Juliet's choices. The guilt was a physical weight on her chest. She'd known there would be consequences, but she'd tried not to think too carefully about what those might be. Now they were undeniable. Her refusal to sacrifice herself was destroying her sisters' futures. "Juliet?" Frederick's voice came from the doorway. "Harrison said you received a letter. Is everything all right?" She looked up, and whatever he saw in her face made him cross the room immediately. "What's happened?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. "Blackmail," he said flatly. "Pure and simple. Your mother is allowing herself to be used as his weapon. She's desperate." Juliet's voice came out hollow. "We all are. And now Emily has lost her engagement. Because of me. Because I was selfish enough to put my own wishes above my family's welfare. No." Frederick knelt beside her chair, forcing her to meet his eyes. "No, Juliet. You were courageous enough to refuse to be sold like chattel. That's not selfishness. That's self-preservation. And any man who would withdraw an engagement because of scandal manufactured by a villain like Blackwood is not worth your sister's tears. You don't understand. In our world, I understand perfectly. I've lived in that world my entire life. But understanding it doesn't mean accepting its cruelty." He took her hands in his, and the warmth of his touch anchored her. "There's another solution, one that would solve all of this." "What solution?" "I have no money, no way to pay the debts. Unless I marry Blackwood, marry me instead." The words hung in the air between them like something solid. Juliet stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What? Marry me?" Frederick repeated, his voice steady and sure. "I have more than enough wealth to settle your family's debts. As Duchess of Thornbury, you'd be beyond Blackwood's reach. He couldn't touch you. Your sisters would be protected by association with the Thornbury name. And you," he paused, his grey eyes searching hers, "you would be free, truly free." Juliet's heart was racing so fast she felt dizzy. "Frederick, you can't. We barely know each other. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for—" "Is it a sacrifice to marry a woman I've come to admire deeply? To spend my life with someone whose intelligence challenges me, whose company I genuinely enjoy, whose courage I respect?" He smiled slightly. "Because from where I stand, Juliet, it sounds rather like the opposite of a sacrifice. But you don't love me." The words hurt to say, but they needed to be said. "This would be a business arrangement, just like the one I fled." "Would it?" Frederick's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I won't claim to be desperately in love with you. We haven't known each other long enough for that. But I care for you, Juliet. I value you. I want to see you happy and safe. And I believe, given time, what we have could grow into something real. Something neither of us expected, but both of us deserve." Tears pricked Juliet's eyes. It was everything and nothing like what she'd dreamed of. A proposal born of necessity, yes, but also of genuine affection. A marriage that would be real, not a prison. Frederick was offering her not just protection, but partnership. "What about you?" she whispered. "Don't you deserve more than a reluctant bride you found squatting in your cottage?" He laughed, and the sound was warm. "You were never reluctant. You were terrified. There's a difference. And as for what I deserve, Juliet, I've spent 5 years in diplomatic service, surrounded by people who say one thing and mean another. You are the first person, in longer than I can remember, who is utterly, sometimes painfully, honest. That alone makes you worth more than any strategically advantageous match my family might have arranged." Juliet looked at him, really looked at him. At the sincerity in his eyes, the strength in his hands holding hers, the way he'd shown up in her life like something from a fairy tale and offered her not rescue, but choice. This was nothing like Blackwood, nothing like the cold transaction her mother had arranged. This was possibility. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it has to be real. I won't be an obligation or a duty. I won't be someone you regret in 5 years when the novelty wears off and you realize you married a scandalous woman for the sake of chivalry. Then we'll make it real." Frederick's voice was fierce. "We'll build something together. Not just the house, but a life. A partnership based on respect and trust and the genuine affection I already feel for you. I can't promise perfect romantic love from the start, but I can promise that I will work every day to earn yours and to deserve the gift of your presence in my life." It was, Juliet thought, the most honest proposal any woman had ever received. No false declarations of undying love, no poetry or grand gestures, just truth offered with both hands. "Yes," she said, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. "Yes, Frederick, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He pulled her to her feet and with careful courtesy kissed her hand. "Then we have a week to plan a wedding and destroy Vincent Blackwood's leverage forever. Come, we have work to do." What followed was a whirlwind. Frederick dispatched Major Harrison to London with a letter for Juliet's mother and a bank draft sufficient to settle every debt the Ashford family owed. He also included a message for Lord Blackwood that Juliet suspected was far less polite than the one sent to her mother. Lady Thornbury threw herself into wedding preparations with the energy of a woman half her age. "Finally," she declared. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other for months. Now, Juliet, about your trousseau." The wedding was set for the following Saturday at the estate's private chapel, with only family and close friends in attendance. Word spread quickly through local society, however, and by the end of the week, all of Suffolk was buzzing with the news. The Duke of Thornbury had returned from abroad and was marrying the scandalous runaway bride. Juliet's mother arrived 3 days before the wedding, tearful and effusive. "Oh, my darling girl, a duchess! I always knew you were destined for greatness, though I admit I didn't expect quite this turn of events." Her selective memory was almost impressive. Juliet accepted her mother's embrace with mixed feelings, but reminded herself that Catherine Ashford was a product of her world, weak where she should be strong, but ultimately trying to protect her daughters in the only ways she knew how. Emily came too, along with Charlotte and little Beatrice. The reunion was tearful and joyful. Emily hugged Juliet so hard her ribs ached. "I'm not sorry about Mr. Pearson," Emily whispered. "He was boring anyway. And now you're going to be a duchess, and we're all going to be fine. And Juliet, are you happy? Really, truly happy?" "I am," Juliet said, and realized with some surprise that it was completely true. "Frederick is a good man, Emmy. I'm very lucky." The night before the wedding, as Juliet sat in her room, surrounded by her sisters, there was a knock at the door. A footman delivered a small box bearing the Thornbury crest. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, antique and beautiful. A note accompanied it in Frederick's strong handwriting. "This was my grandmother's. She was, by all accounts, fiercely independent and utterly brilliant. Rather like you. It seems appropriate that you should wear her ring. Tomorrow you become my duchess. Tonight, know that I consider myself the most fortunate man in England. Yours, Frederick." Juliet slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit perfectly. Charlotte sighed romantically. "He really does love you, doesn't he?" "I think he might," Juliet admitted, "in time. And I think I might love him too." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, autumn's last gift before winter's arrival. Juliet wore a gown of cream silk that Lady Thornbury had somehow procured in less than a week, with Brussels lace and seed pearls. Her sisters wove late roses from the Thornbury gardens into her hair. As she walked down the chapel's short aisle on Major Harrison's arm, her father being dead and her mother too emotional to manage it, Juliet saw Frederick waiting at the altar. He wore a dark blue coat that brought out his eyes, and when he saw her, his smile was like something precious and private, meant only for her. The ceremony was simple and profound. When Frederick took her hand and repeated his vows, his voice was steady and sure. When Juliet promised to love and honor him, she meant every word. And when the vicar declared them husband and wife, and Frederick kissed her for the first time, Juliet felt something click into place, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. The wedding breakfast was held at the manor, which had been miraculously transformed. Flowers filled every room, candles glowed in every window, and staff hired during the frantic wedding preparations moved efficiently through the gathering. Local gentry mixed with London visitors, and if some of them whispered about the scandal, they did so quietly and out of the Duke's hearing. Lord Blackwood notably did not attend. Rumour had it he'd left for his northern estates in a fury when he received word of Frederick's intentions. Juliet found she couldn't even muster the energy to care about his reaction. He was her past. Frederick was her future. As the afternoon faded to evening and guests began to depart, Frederick found Juliet standing in the restored gardens, looking up at Thornbury Manor, her home now, truly hers. "Any regrets?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist in a gesture that already felt natural. "None," she said honestly, "though I still can't quite believe this is real. A month ago, I was hiding in your gamekeeper's cottage, terrified and alone. Now I'm Duchess of Thornbury." "Now you're my wife," Frederick corrected. "The title is just a bonus." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I meant what I said, Juliet. I will spend every day earning your love, building the marriage we both deserve. We're partners now in everything." "Partners," Juliet echoed, and lifted her face to his. "I like the sound of that." When he kissed her, it was different from the chaste kiss at the altar, deeper, more promising. A beginning rather than an ending. Around them, autumn leaves drifted down like blessings, and inside the glowing windows of Thornbury Manor, their family and friends celebrated a love story that had started with running away and ended with running towards something infinitely better. The first weeks of marriage were an education in intimacy, not merely the physical kind, though Juliet discovered that Frederick was as considerate and patient in the marriage bed as he was in every other aspect of their life together, but the deeper intimacy of truly knowing another person. They established routines that became rituals, morning rides through the estate, where they discussed plans for the day, afternoon work sessions, where Juliet managed correspondence and household accounts, while Frederick handled estate business, both of them companionably silent in the library. Evenings with Lady Thornbury, or sometimes alone, reading aloud to each other or simply talking until the fire burned low. Juliet learned Frederick's tells, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when frustrated, the slight smile that meant he was holding back a laugh, the particular expression he got when he was about to challenge one of her opinions in a discussion. He learned hers too, her habit of pacing when thinking deeply, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the brightness in her eyes when she was genuinely happy. "You know," Frederick said one evening about 6 weeks after their wedding, "I don't think I understood what marriage could be until now. I always thought of it as a duty, a contract. But this is something else entirely." They were in Juliet's sitting room. She still kept her own quarters, though Frederick spent increasing amounts of time there, and she in his chambers. The boundaries between his space and hers were gradually dissolving into ours. "What is it?" Juliet asked, looking up from the letter she'd been writing to Emily. "A partnership, yes, but more than that. A friendship." He sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hand. "I find I tell you things I've never told anyone. I trust your judgment on matters I'd normally handle alone. You've become essential, Juliet, not as a wife in the abstract sense, but as you specifically. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." She squeezed his hand. "Because I feel the same way. I was so afraid marriage would mean losing myself, becoming someone's possession. Instead, I feel more myself than ever. You give me room to be fully who I am. Always," he promised. "That's the point of all this, to build a life where we both flourish." But their peaceful bubble couldn't remain untouched by the outside world forever. In early December, a visitor arrived unannounced, Lord Vincent Blackwood himself, demanding an audience with the Duke of Thornbury. Frederick received him in the drawing room, with Juliet present at his insistence. "He has no power over you now," Frederick had told her, "but if facing him would be too difficult." "No." Juliet straightened her spine. "I want to see him. I want him to see me, not as the terrified girl who ran, but as the Duchess of Thornbury." Blackwood looked older than Juliet remembered, his face haggard and his eyes cold with fury. He barely glanced at her before addressing Frederick. "This is unconscionable," he began without preamble. "You stole my betrothed." "I stole nothing," Frederick interrupted calmly. "Miss Ashford was never your possession to lose. She made a choice, as was her right. After she made a commitment, the contracts were drawn, the debts settled, The debts were settled by me, and more fairly than you intended. Frederick's voice could have cut glass. I've reviewed the terms you proposed, Blackwood. You would have forgiven £3,000 in debt in exchange for a wife, while simultaneously maintaining financial control over the Ashford family for the remainder of Lady Catherine's life. It was exploitation disguised as generosity. Blackwood's face darkened. That's a slanderous... It's documented fact. I have your contract signed and notarized. Would you like me to discuss its terms in detail, perhaps before the House of Lords? The threat landed like a physical blow. Blackwood's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he finally looked at Juliet. You've made a grave mistake, girl. Thornbury may be wealthier, but he'll tire of you soon enough. You're damaged goods now, a scandalous runaway. When he's done with you, choose your next words very carefully, Frederick said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. You are speaking about my wife, the Duchess of Thornbury. Any insult to her is an insult to me, and I will respond accordingly. Your wife, Blackwood spat the words, was promised to me. I suffered public humiliation because of her cowardice. You suffered embarrassment because you're a brute who drives wives to despair. Juliet spoke for the first time, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. I know what happened to your previous wives, my lord. So does most of London, though people are too polite to say it directly. You wanted me because I was young and frightened enough to control. But I chose differently. I chose freedom and respect and a partner who sees me as a person, not a possession. How dare you? I dare, because I'm finally free to dare. Juliet stood, and Frederick immediately rose beside her, a united front. You have no power over me anymore, Lord Blackwood. My family's debts are settled. My sisters are protected by the Thornbury name, and I am beyond your reach in every possible way. Blackwood looked between them, his expression twisting with impotent rage. This isn't over. Yes, Frederick said quietly. It is. You have no leverage, no grounds for complaint, and no reasonable cause to continue this pursuit. If you attempt to harass my wife or her family further, I will ensure that every detail of your marriages, including the suspicious circumstances surrounding your wives' deaths, becomes a matter of public record and parliamentary inquiry. Do I make myself clear? The colour drained from Blackwood's face. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked from the room. They heard him bark orders at his driver, heard the carriage pull away at speed. Juliet discovered she was trembling. Frederick's arm came around her immediately, steadying her. It's over, he murmured. Truly over. He won't risk exposure. I know. Juliet leaned into his strength, but seeing him again, it reminded me how close I came to a very different life. But you didn't. Frederick tilted her face up to meet his eyes. You chose courage over compliance, and every day I'm grateful that you did, not just because it brought you to me, but because you refused to let fear dictate your future. That evening, they received a message from Juliet's mother. Lady Catherine wanted to visit, to see how Juliet was settling into her new life. The letter was tentative, almost apologetic, so different from the desperate, demanding tone of her previous correspondence. Do you want to see her? Frederick asked. Juliet considered. Her feelings about her mother were complicated, love tangled with resentment, understanding mixed with anger. Catherine had tried to sell her to save the family, but she'd also been drowning in circumstances she couldn't control. Yes, she said finally, but with clear boundaries. She needs to understand that I'm not the dutiful daughter she tried to make me. I'm my own person now. Lady Catherine arrived the following week, along with all three of Juliet's sisters. The reunion was emotional, tears and embraces and exclamations over how well Juliet looked, how magnificent Thornbury Manor was, how handsome the Duke seemed. But it was the private conversation with her mother that mattered most. Juliet received her in the morning room, sunlight streaming through tall windows, and didn't offer tea. Juliet, my darling, Catherine began, reaching for her daughter's hands. I've been so worried. You tried to force me into a marriage with a man who killed his previous wives, Juliet said quietly. We need to acknowledge that before we can move forward. Catherine's face crumpled. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The debts were so crushing, and Lord Blackwood seemed like the only solution. I told myself the rumors about his wives were just gossip, that surely you chose to believe what was convenient rather than what was true. Juliet kept her voice steady. I understand you were desperate, Mother. I even forgive you to an extent. But I need you to understand something. I will never again sacrifice my well-being to meet society's expectations or family obligations. I will help my sisters however I can, support you financially, maintain our relationship, but on my terms, not yours. You've changed, Catherine whispered. I've grown. I've found my voice. And I have a husband who encourages that growth rather than trying to suppress it. Juliet softened slightly. I'm not trying to hurt you, Mother, but we need a new understanding between us, one based on honesty. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Juliet's surprise, she nodded. You're right. I've been weak when I should have been strong, compliant when I should have fought. I see that now, and I see that you're thriving here in a way you never could have with him. She shuddered. When Frederick sent that letter explaining what he'd discovered about Lord Blackwood's contracts, I was horrified, truly horrified. I nearly sold you to a monster. But you didn't, Juliet said gently. I escaped, and Frederick helped me find a better path. We can move forward from here, Mother, but it has to be different. Different, Catherine echoed. Yes, I can do different. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Too much had happened for that. But it was a beginning, and that was enough. The sisters' visit lasted a week, during which Thornbury filled with laughter and chaos. Emily confided that she'd received attention from a new gentleman, a country squire who'd been unimpressed by the scandal and quite impressed by Emily herself. Charlotte announced her intention to never marry and instead become a writer of sensational novels. And little Beatrice simply revelled in having her eldest sister back. You're happy here, aren't you? Emily asked on their last evening as they sat together in Juliet's sitting room. Really, truly happy. I am, Juliet said. I didn't expect to be. I thought I was trading one prison for another, just a more comfortable one. But Frederick, he's given me freedom, Emmy. Freedom to be myself, to have opinions, to be a partner rather than an ornament. It's everything I didn't know a marriage could be. He loves you, Emily said with certainty. The way he looks at you when you're not watching, it's rather beautiful, actually. Did he love her? Juliet wasn't sure. Frederick cared for her, respected her, desired her. All of that was clear. But love? They'd never spoken the word, both perhaps afraid to claim something that might not be reciprocated. That night, after her family had departed and the house fell quiet, Juliet found Frederick in the library, reviewing estate documents by firelight. They've gone? He asked, looking up with a smile. Yes, and I find I already miss the chaos. She settled beside him on the sofa. Frederick, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you... She hesitated, suddenly nervous. Do you ever regret this? Marrying me so quickly, taking on my family's problems, binding yourself to a woman with a scandalous past? Frederick set aside his papers and turned to face her fully. Not for a single moment. Juliet, you are the best thing that's ever happened to me. You've given me a reason to invest in this place, to build a life beyond duty and obligation. You've made me laugh more in these few months than I did in 5 years abroad. How could I possibly regret that? But do you... She forced herself to finish the question. Do you love me? His expression softened. Is that what you've been wondering? My darling girl, I've been in love with you since you stood up to Blackwood in this very room, brave and fierce and utterly magnificent. I didn't say it because I didn't want to pressure you, didn't want you to feel obligated to return feelings you might not have developed yet. But yes, Juliet, I love you, completely. Relief and joy flooded through her in equal measure. I love you too, she said, the words tumbling out. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or too presumptuous or... He kissed her, deep and tender, cutting off her anxious rambling. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. We're absurd, Frederick murmured. Two adults, both in love, both too nervous to say it. We're careful, Juliet corrected. We've both been hurt before, by different circumstances. Being careful with each other's hearts isn't absurd, it's wise. And then let me be wisely clear. I love you, Juliet Thornbury, and I intend to spend the rest of our lives proving it. I love you too, Frederick. She leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment settling into her bones. And I choose this. I choose you. I choose us. I choose this life we're building. Every day I choose it. Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering Thornbury's grounds in white. Inside, warm and safe and loved, Juliet felt the last vestiges of fear dissolve. She was free, not just from Blackwood, but from all the constraints that had once defined her existence. She was the Duchess of Thornbury. She was Frederick's wife and partner, but most importantly, she was simply, finally herself. Spring arrived at Thornbury like a promise fulfilled, sudden and glorious, transforming the grounds from winter's grey austerity to riots of colour. Daffodils carpeted the south lawn, cherry trees dripped pink blossoms, and the gardens that Juliet had spent months planning and planting burst into exuberant life. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and Thornbury Manor had been utterly transformed. What had been a neglected estate, slowly returning to nature, was now one of the finest houses in Suffolk, renovated, staffed, and filled with life. But more than the physical restoration, it was the atmosphere that had changed. The manor felt like a home now, warm and welcoming, a place where laughter echoed through the halls and purpose animated every room. Juliet stood in what had become her private domain, the conservatory she'd convinced Frederick to add during renovations. Glass walls let in floods of light, and plants from all over the world filled the space with green vitality. She was working on a new bed of roses, her hands deep in soil, thoroughly undignified and completely happy, when she heard approaching footsteps. "The Dowager Countess of Ravensworth has arrived," Frederick announced, leaning against the doorframe with an amused expression. She asked if the Duchess was available to receive her, and I had to admit that the Duchess was probably in the conservatory, covered in dirt and talking to the plants. Juliet laughed, brushing soil from her hands. "Let me guess. Lady Ravensworth was scandalized. On the contrary, she seemed delighted. She's in the drawing room now, telling Aunt Agatha about her own passion for gardening." He crossed to her, unconcerned about getting dirt on his coat as he pulled her close. "You're happy." It wasn't a question, but Juliet answered anyway. "Absurdly so. Some mornings I wake up and have to remind myself this is real, that I get to live this life with you, doing work that matters to me." The work she referred to had expanded far beyond managing Thornbury. Juliet had discovered a passion for estate management that went deeper than pretty decorating. She'd thrown herself into studying modern agricultural techniques, worker welfare, and efficient administration. The Thornbury estates were now models of progressive management. Tenant farmers received fair rents and assistance with improvements, workers earned decent wages with reasonable hours, and the land itself was carefully stewarded for future generations. But Juliet's influence had spread beyond Thornbury's borders. She'd become something of a leader among the local gentry wives, organizing charitable efforts and advocating for reforms. She'd established a school for tenant children, a lending library for the village, and a cooperative where local women could sell their crafts for fair prices. The scandal that had once defined her had faded, replaced by respect for her intelligence and genuine care for others' welfare. "Lady Ravensworth probably wants your advice on establishing a school on her own estate," Frederick predicted. "You've inspired half the county to rethink how they manage their properties." "Good," Juliet smiled. "If I can use my position to make even a small difference in people's lives, then perhaps all the drama that brought me here served a purpose." They'd received news of Lord Blackwood recently. He'd remarried with almost indecent haste, selecting a very young, very poor girl with no family to protect her. The news had made Juliet's blood run cold, But Frederick had immediately taken action, quietly ensuring that magistrates and local authorities near Blackwood's estate were made aware of his history and encouraged to watch for signs of abuse. It wasn't enough. Juliet wanted to rescue the poor girl directly, but it was what they could do without overstepping legal boundaries. "You can't save everyone," Frederick had told her gently when she'd raged about the limitations of their power. "No," she'd agreed, "but I can save some, and I can work to change the laws that make women vulnerable to men like Blackwood in the first place." That had become another of her projects, corresponding with reformers in London, supporting efforts to change property laws and marriage regulations that left women with so few protections. It was slow, frustrating work, but Juliet had learned patience and persistence. After receiving Lady Ravensworth and spending a pleasant hour discussing educational initiatives, Juliet found time to read the latest letters from her sisters. Emily's news was particularly exciting. She was engaged to her country squire, a Mr. Thomas Whitfield, who by all accounts was a thoroughly decent man who adored her. The wedding was planned for June. Charlotte's letter was characteristically dramatic. "Dear Juliet, I have sold my first story. A magazine in London has purchased my tale of Gothic romance, and I'm to be paid £5 for it. Mother is horrified. Apparently writing for money is terribly vulgar, but I don't care. I'm going to be a famous novelist someday. Just you wait. Perhaps I'll write about a brave heroine who runs away to live in an abandoned cottage and catches the attention of a handsome duke." Juliet laughed, though Charlotte's threat to fictionalize her story was somewhat alarming. Still, she was proud of her sister's accomplishment and independence. Even little Beatrice was thriving, her letters full of observations about nature and requests for books on botany. Juliet had already decided to invite Beatrice to spend the summer at Thornbury, where they could explore the gardens and countryside together. That evening, as Juliet dressed for dinner, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused, struck by the difference between this woman and the terrified girl who'd fled to a gamekeeper's cottage 9 months ago. She looked healthier, certainly. Good food and outdoor work had brought color to her cheeks and vitality to her frame. But it was more than physical. She carried herself differently now, with confidence and purpose. Her eyes held a light that had been missing before. She looked like someone who'd found her place in the world, because she had. "Admiring yourself?" Frederick asked, emerging from his dressing room in evening clothes. "Admiring how far I've come," Juliet corrected. "Do you remember the night you found me? I was so frightened, so desperate, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Frederick came to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. In the mirror, they made a striking picture, Duke and Duchess, partners in every sense. "You know what I think about sometimes? What if the storm hadn't driven me to the cottage that night? What if I'd waited even one more day to inspect the property? We might have missed each other entirely." "Fate," Juliet said lightly, but she felt the weight of it. How easily things might have been different. How close she'd come to never knowing this happiness. "Or luck," Frederick countered. "Either way, I'm grateful." "So am I." Dinner that night was a lively affair. Lady Thornbury held court at one end of the table, regaling them with a scandalous story about her youth that may or may not have been entirely factual. Major Harrison had joined them, as he often did, and he and Frederick were debating some aspect of crop rotation that Juliet found simultaneously boring and endearing in its earnestness. This was her family now, not the one she'd been born into, but the one she'd chosen and built. And it was enough. More than enough. After dinner, Frederick requested her presence in the library. Juliet found him standing by the desk, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked. "A gift and perhaps a presumption." He handed it to her with uncharacteristic nervousness. "Open it." Inside was a book, leather-bound, expensive, and completely blank. "I thought you might want to write it all down," Frederick explained. "Your story. Not for publication necessarily, but for yourself, for our future children perhaps, so they'll know what their mother survived and accomplished." Juliet ran her fingers over the smooth leather, moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Our future children. I hope so. Eventually. If you want them. Frederick took her hand. I know we haven't discussed it, but I find myself imagining it sometimes. Children running through Thornbury's halls, carrying your intelligence and courage, growing up knowing they're valued for who they are, rather than what's expected of them. I want that too, Juliet admitted. Not yet. There's still so much I want to do, so much work to finish. But yes, someday. Children who'll never know what it means to be sold or controlled or treated as anything less than fully human. Then we'll make that world for them, Frederick promised. Together. As summer approached, Thornbury prepared to host Emily's wedding. The ceremony would be small and intimate, held in the estate chapel where Juliet and Frederick had married. Emily had requested it specifically. She wanted to begin her marriage in the same place her sister had found happiness. The night before the wedding, Juliet found Emily standing in the garden, looking up at Thornbury's glowing windows. Nervous? Juliet asked, linking her arm through her sister's. A little, Emily admitted, but excited too. Thomas is everything I hoped for. Kind, steady, honest, nothing like... She trailed off delicately. Nothing like Blackwood, Juliet finished. I know, and I'm so glad you found someone worthy of you. I'm glad you escaped, Emily said quietly. When you disappeared, I was terrified. Mother was hysterical. Blackwood was furious, and I didn't know if you were safe or scared or... But you were brave enough to run, and it saved your life. It saved all of us, really. You showed us that we didn't have to accept what was expected. I just refused to be broken, Juliet said. But it took finding Frederick to really understand that I could build something new. That refusing the wrong thing was only the first step. Choosing the right thing was what mattered. You chose well, Emily smiled. He adores you, you know. It's rather sickeningly romantic. Juliet laughed. I adore him too, which I never expected. I thought I was escaping to nothing, accepting a marriage of convenience at best. Instead, I found a partner, a true equal. It's more than I dared to dream. The wedding the next day was beautiful, simple but heartfelt, filled with genuine joy rather than social obligation. As Juliet watched Emily and Thomas exchange vows, she caught Frederick's eye across the chapel. He smiled, and she felt the full weight of her gratitude for the path that had led her here. That evening, after the celebration had ended and guests had departed, Juliet and Frederick walked through Thornbury's grounds. Summer twilight painted everything in shades of gold and purple, and night-blooming flowers released their perfume into the warm air. Do you know what today is? Frederick asked suddenly. Emily's wedding day? Also the anniversary of the day I found you in the cottage. 9 months ago today, I crashed through that door, furious about trespassers, and found the woman who would change my entire life. Juliet stopped walking, turning to face him. It changed mine too. I ran away from one fate and stumbled into another. Better than anything I'd imagined. You gave me safety when I was desperate, partnership when I was lonely, and love when I thought I was unworthy of it. You were never unworthy. Frederick cupped her face in his hands. You were brave and brilliant and deserving of everything good. I'm just grateful I was the one who got to help you see that. We helped each other, Juliet corrected. You were half alive, remember? Going through motions. We brought each other back to life. Then here's to living, Frederick said. To choosing each other every day. To building the life we want rather than accepting the one we're given. To blooming where we're planted, even when we plant ourselves somewhere unexpected. More to blooming, Juliet echoed and kissed him as stars began to appear overhead. Around them, Thornbury stood solid and welcoming, no longer an abandoned relic, but a home filled with purpose and love. Inside those walls, they'd built something real, not perfect, but genuine and growing stronger every day. Juliet had started her journey hiding in an abandoned cottage, terrified and alone. She'd ended it as Duchess of Thornbury, loved and purposeful, surrounded by family and engaged in meaningful work. The path between those 2 points hadn't been easy, but it had been hers to choose. And that choice, to run towards something better rather than simply away from something terrible. to believe she deserved more than what others said she should accept, to trust in the possibility of real partnership and genuine love. That choice had made all the difference. In her room later that night, Juliet opened the blank journal Frederick had given her. On the first page, in her careful handwriting, she began her story. She hides in an abandoned cabin to avoid being claimed until the Duke breaks her resistance. But resistance, as it turned out, was not what needed breaking. It was the chains of expectation, the walls of limitation, the prisons built by others' demands. And when those shattered, what remained was not submission, but choice. And choosing, I learned, is the truest form of freedom. Outside, an owl called across Thornbury's grounds. Juliet smiled, set down her pen, and went to join her husband, her partner, her love, her choice, in the life they were building together. One story had ended in an abandoned cottage. Another, infinitely better, had begun there too. And this story, Juliet knew with absolute certainty, would have a happy ending, because she would write it that way, one chosen day at a time. If you loved this story of courage, redemption, and choosing your own path, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic historical tales. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of Juliet and Frederick's journey. Did their love story capture your heart? What was your favorite moment? And as always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. These stories travel far and wide, and I love knowing they've reached you. Until next time, remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself.